a U.S. Senate debate in Kentucky. Following that, Elizabeth Dole at a campaign rally in Indianapolis. Then First Lady Hillary Rodham Clinton speaks at Harvard University. And later, a Senate hearing on U.S. troops in Bosnia. Next, a U.S. Senate debate in Kentucky. Sunday, incumbent Republican Senator Mitch McConnell faced Democratic candidate Steve Beshear during this hour-long debate.
Welcome to River Park Center in Owensboro. Tonight, the Owensboro Messenger-Inquirer, in association with WOMI AM and WBKR FM radio, present a U.S. senatorial forum. The candidates are Republican incumbent U.S. Senator Mitch McConnell and Democratic challenger, former Lieutenant Governor of Kentucky, Stephen L. Beshear. Our moderator for the evening is Bob Ashley, editor of the Owensboro Messenger-Inquirer.
Welcome. I'm Bob Ashley, editor of the Messenger-Inquirer, moderator of this debate. On behalf of the Messenger-Inquirer and of WMI WBKR, I'd like to thank those of you in the audience for coming tonight. I'd like to thank those of you who are listening or watching. And on behalf of the sponsors, the audience, and all of the citizens of Kentucky, I want to thank the candidates for being in Owensboro here this evening. Each candidate will make an opening statement. Then we'll have questions from a panel of journalists. In the second half of the debate, the candidates will question each other, and then each will make a closing statement. Our candidates are, on my far right, on my near right, Republican Senator Mitch McConnell. McConnell of Louisville was first elected to the Senate in 1984 and is a former Jefferson County Judge Executive. He is married, with 3 children. His wife, Elaine Chao, is in the audience this evening. On my far right is Democrat Steve Beshear. Beshear of Lexington was Lieutenant Governor of Kentucky from 1983 to 1987, and prior to that was the state's Attorney General. He is married with 2 children, and his wife, Jane, is with us this evening. Each candidate will now make a 2-minute opening statement. The selection of who would speak first was decided by a coin toss. Mr. Beshear, would you please begin?
Thank you, Bob. First, let me thank the sponsors of this debate and each and every one of you who are out there watching and listening tonight. When you look at this campaign this fall and the 2 candidates, Steve Beshear and Mitch McConnell, you're going to be looking at 2 folks with a very different set of values, with a very different set of priorities. That's the kind of thing that I've been trying to talk about in this campaign. And I want to call upon Mitch McConnell here tonight to join with me in let's making sure that we're going to talk about issues and not insults. Let's talk about ideas and not name-calling or negative attack ads and negative campaigning. Will you join with me now, Mitch, in making that pledge?
Absolutely.
Great, great. I hope you mean it, and I know your ads will change because of it. Because we need to talk about the vital issues in this campaign that affect working families here in this state every day. For instance, I want to go to Washington and protect Medicare for our parents and grandparents. They have made a commitment to this country, and they've made this country what it is today. I want to go up there and protect the Medicaid funding that helps so many of our folks in nursing homes who can't afford that kind of care themselves. I want to go up there and make sure that we keep the most important commitment we can make, and that is to the education of our children. I want to make sure that Head Start program is still there for our disadvantaged youngsters. I want to make sure that those drug prevention programs in school are intact. I want to make sure that that college loan program that sends so many of Kentucky's youngsters to college who otherwise could not afford to get a higher education is going to be strong and healthy. And on each one of these issues, Mitch McConnell last year joined Newt Gingrich and Bob Dole in voting to drastically cut them. He voted to drastically cut $270 billion out of the Medicare program. He voted to cut the Medicaid program, the college loan program, the environmental funds, all to give a tax break to the wealthiest folks in this country. Those are the issues we need to talk about, both tonight and in this campaign, and I look forward to it.
Thank you, Mr. Beshear.
Thank
Mr.
you.
McConnell.
Thank you very much. I, too, want to thank the Owensboro Messenger for sponsoring this event and KET for covering it. The race for the Senate this year is about courage, it's about independence, and it's about clout. I believe that during my tenure in the Senate, I've demonstrated courage and independence, and I now have, as a result of my seniority, considerable clout. With regard to courage and independence, what that means is being able to take on a tough job, like being chairman of the Senate Ethics Committee and presiding over the expulsion of one of the members of the Senate of my own party. Only 2 members of the Senate have been expelled in this century. Nothing could be tougher. As you can imagine, there was considerable pressure to do otherwise, fear that the seat would be lost, and indeed, it was lost. The courage and the independence to go against the flow when that's needed. For example, when plans were made to reduce the funding for Land Between the Lakes, I was there to make certain that LBL got the funding that it needed. When plans were laid to eliminate the Appalachian Regional Commission, I was there to offer the amendment in the Senate that passed by just 1 vote to save the Appalachian Regional Commission. I've been there when Kentucky needed assistance to make sure that our needs were met, even as we moved toward a balanced budget, and I proudly cast my vote for the first balanced budget in 26 years. I make no apologies for casting my vote for the first balanced budget in 26 years. And one of the good things that came out of that debate with the President is he's now also committed to balancing the budget over 7 years. So I think it's safe to say that next year, no matter who the President of the United States is, we are at long last going to put the federal government's fiscal house in order.
Thank you, Mr. McConnell. Now we'll go to our panel of journalists. Bill Bartleman will pose the first question. Mr. Beshear will be the first to answer. He will have 90 seconds to respond. Then Mr. McConnell will have 90 seconds to respond. We'll rotate through the panel of journalists with the candidates alternating and who responds first. Our first questioner, Bill Bartleman, is a veteran political writer for the Paducah Sun. He has been covering politics since 1976. Bill?
Everyone agrees that tobacco is major to Kentucky's economy. There also is little disagreement that tobacco usage causes some health problems. Over the next 6 years, the next senator is going to have to defend tobacco vigorously for Kentucky. How do you balance the concerns over health care with the balance over the need for Kentucky's economy to continue the tobacco?
Bill, if there's one thing that the voters of Kentucky can be sure of, is that Steve Beshear is going to go up there next year and stand shoulder to shoulder with Wendell Ford and make sure that our tobacco program is still going to be strong and make sure that our tobacco farmers are still going to be protected. Yes, I think all of us agree with the idea of discouraging teenage smoking, but we certainly don't agree with the method that the president has chosen to try to do that. And I think we're going to fight the president. I think we're going to win that battle. Wendell Ford has a bill up there right now that would do just that. It would regulate teenage smoking, try to reduce it, and at the same time, it would make sure that FDA stays off the farm. And that's what we're going to have to do. We need to work hard to open up new markets, Bill, for our tobacco in the future, and we can. You know, there's been a lot of scare tactics going on in the last 2 or 3 months, but I think I can assure you that the farmers this fall are going to get good prices just like that they were going to before we started talking about all this FDA stuff. And this tobacco program is going to stay healthy because I'm going to go up there with Wendell Ford and make sure that it does.
Al?
Well, we all know that smoking tobacco is not good for people. But if you eliminated the tobacco market in Kentucky, there'd still be tobacco grown. It's grown all over the world. So the issue is whether we're going to be able to save our right to grow this legal crop. I don't have to tell the people of Kentucky we grow it in virtually every county of Kentucky. There are 60,000 farm families who make some or all of their income from tobacco. And the President of the United States has launched an all-out assault on our #1 cash crop by suggesting that the FDA be allowed to regulate tobacco as if it were an illegal drug, effectively making drug dealers out of tobacco farmers. Now, we've had a lot of experience with the Democrats in Kentucky on the tobacco issue. Governor Patton said when he ran for office he wouldn't even support Bill Clinton if he took the step that he took a month ago. Well, as soon as the election was over, he said, well, I didn't really mean it. I need to work within the administration because I'll have more influence with the president to keep him from doing this if I support him. So he worked for the last 9 months, and presumably he didn't have any influence because the president did it anyway. If the tobacco growers of Kentucky want somebody who will stand up to Bill Clinton and try to keep FDA off the family farm in Kentucky, there's a clear choice in this election. There isn't any Democrat who in the end is going to stand up to Bill Clinton when it comes to tobacco.
Our next question is from Joe Corcoran, news director for the past year and a half at WBKO-TV, the ABC affiliate in Bowling Green, Kentucky. Joe?
Gentlemen, with NAFTA passed, what many opponents feared about NAFTA has come to pass in South Central Kentucky and elsewhere in the Commonwealth, with textile and apparel businesses closing down and those jobs going to Central America. What do you tell the hundreds of Kentuckians out of jobs now, and what can you do to bring those jobs back?
Joe, this is to me.
Yes, sir.
Well, like Bill Clinton, I voted for NAFTA, and I would vote for NAFTA again. A separate issue is the question of what may happen to textile jobs. Senator Ford has introduced, and I'm co-sponsoring, an effort to try to keep illegal dumping in the textile industry from coming in to Kentucky. But what ironically happened along at the same time that NAFTA was passed is the Mexican economy went into the tube as a result of a bad decision by the Mexican government to devalue the peso. The last thing we want to do is do anything to damage trade with Canada and Mexico. 40% of Kentucky's exports go to Canada and Mexico, and 100,000 jobs in Kentucky exist because of foreign trade. So NAFTA, while it has not yet produced for us the kind of exports into Mexico we had hoped because of the Mexican economy, will in the long run be good for the United States. At the same time, we need to move to protect the domestic textile industry to the maximum extent possible. Wendell Ford is working on that, and I'm a co-sponsor of his bill.
Joe, I'll tell you what I'd do. I'd have voted against NAFTA, pure and simple. Mitch is worried about Canada and Mexico. I'm worried about America, and I'm worried about American workers, and I'm worried about American jobs. You know, I'm for free trade. That's easy to say, but I'm also for fair trade. And it has to be fair for our workers and our businesses in the Commonwealth of Kentucky and across this country before we ought to be allowing it to go on. You go out here and make these agreements with countries like the NAFTA agreement, and you let them continue child labor. You let them continue lax environmental laws. You let them continue lax labor laws so that they can produce goods far less expensive than our goods, come into this country, sell those goods, and undercut our companies and undercut our American workers. That's not fair. That's not the way we ought to be doing it, and that's a big difference between Mitch McConnell and Steve Beshear. I'm going to go up there and stand up for Kentucky and American workers.
The next question is from Keith Lawrence, who covers politics for the Messenger-Inquirer here in Owensboro. Like Bartleman, he's a veteran of more than 2 decades of writing about politics. Keith?
Gentlemen, if you could go to Washington in January and some genie said you can pass any piece of legislation, no matter how sweeping, and it will be signed by the president, what would that legislation be?
That's our first. I would go up to Washington, Keith, and stop the buying and selling of United States senators like they're sacks of potatoes. Because right now the special interest groups own the Congress lock, stock, and barrel. And it is time to put an end to that. It is time to put some real campaign limits on spending. You know, you go out here on the street anymore and ask anybody, what do you think of the United States Congress? And you get the same answer. Well, they don't represent me. They're not up there for me. They're up there for the big special interest groups that are pouring millions and millions of dollars into their campaign coffers so that they can keep their jobs. Senator Mitch McConnell has stood up there for 12 years, I am embarrassed to say, and has fought every single effort to bring any kind of campaign finance reform to the table. He has even said he wants more money in politics and not less. And that's just wrong, ladies and gentlemen. We are selling influence in Washington now. It's not just Mitch, it's the whole system. It needs to be changed. It's a corrupt system. It is time to put spending limits on so that we can take these elections out of the hands of those special interest groups and put them back in the hands of the people of Kentucky and the people of the United States of America.
Well, Keith, Steve is the king of special interest. He is the favorite charity of every trial lawyer in America this year. But the thing he just outlined is not the most important issue confronting America. Balancing the budget for our children and for their children is clearly the most important issue. And Keith's question was, if you could pass one bill, what would you pass? I would pass a genuine, credible, believable, balanced budget for our children. A child born last year, if he or she lived to be 75 years old and we do not act, will owe the government $185,000 in interest on the national debt because of our dereliction of duty. We came very close this year. The president's now committed to balancing the budget in 7 years. No matter who the president is next year, we're going to get that job done. It will save our grandchildren from a mountain of debt. And also, interestingly enough, there's something in it for those of us who are here and who are now and still in the productive parts of our lives. 2% less on your home mortgage because interest rates will come down. 2% less on your car loan because interest will come down. There isn't any question what the most important issue confronting the country is, Keith, and that is getting the fiscal house of the federal government in order.
Okay. Bill Bartleman, it's your question again, directed first to Mr. McConnell.
Let's continue the theme regarding the special interest and their involvement in this campaign and other campaigns. Senator McConnell, I believe in your 12 years in the Senate, you've averaged about $1 million a year in your campaign war chest. Unions are spending millions of dollars in Kentucky, or at least well over $1 million on the various races in Kentucky for the Democratic candidates. What needs to be done to, every time we turn on the television, we see ads, and I think you two are just starting to spend your money now, so over the next month, we're going to see more ads, political ads, than we are cartoons on TV. What needs to be done to try to control this and to stop the influence that these groups have and the confusion that people have over watching the ads, because one says it's black, the other says it's white. It's really confusing to voters. What needs to be done?
Well, Bill, as you know, speech can sometimes be a messy thing. Many of us in politics are not always pleased with the speech exercised by the newspapers, and they are never pleased with the speech exercised by the people who are running for office. The Supreme Court has made it quite clear. In our society, spending is speech, and it's not permissible under the First Amendment to go around and shut people up and to say you can't participate in the political process. So what you're seeing this year are the voices of a whole lot of groups and a whole lot of Americans who want to make a difference in this year's election. And so they say, what can I do? I can contribute to my favorite candidate. There is, however, one massive abuse that really stands out when you think about what needs to be changed in the campaign finance system. In 1994, 40% of the members of organized labor voted for Republicans. Yet 99.9% of the money spent by organized labor went to Democrats. How does that happen? Well, it happens because the union bosses are able to extract, through union dues, money from their members, regardless of their views, to spend however they see fit. So one of the things that clearly ought to be at the top of the agenda next year is a Union Democracy Act, under which union bosses had to raise their money from their members voluntarily rather than through extraction.
Mr. Beshear?
You notice, Bill, that there wasn't a word said about limiting spending. You know, to equate free speech with the dollar bill is a little bit ridiculous. Mitch has spent the last 12 years raising $12 million from the special interest groups to keep his seat up there, to keep his job. When you break that down on a per-day basis, he's been spending, trying to raise $2,700 every single day he's been up there supposedly representing the people of this state. That's just not the way a United States senator ought to be spending his or her time. We ought to be working for the working families of this state. Mitch said that the most important thing is a balanced budget, and it is an important thing. But you know why we don't have one? It's because all these special interest groups are up there buying these folks in terms of campaign contributions so that they'll protect their favorite tax break. They try to balance the budget, and who do they balance it on the back of? On the backs of seniors and on the backs of children, because they don't give big contributions. They turned around and gave the very folks in the corporate boardrooms that gave all of those big campaign contributions to them over the last 12 years, they tried to give them a $245 billion tax break. They turned around on Kentucky with the earned income tax credit cut they tried to do and tried to raise taxes on 250,000 low-income working Kentuckians. That's what's wrong with this system. That's why we don't have a balanced budget. That's why we can't get anything done. It is time to put a stop to the big money in politics.
Joe Corcoran, your question?
The Senate votes on the budget tomorrow. The House passed it yesterday to keep the government going. Mr. Beshear, after 2 government shutdowns, how do you see yourself working with the other side in Washington politically and avoiding gridlock?
Joe, that's a very good question, and I'm glad you brought it up. Because if there's one thing that I'm sick and tired of, and I think the people of this country are sick and tired of, it's the extreme partisanship in Washington, D.C. that's been going on up there the last 2 or 3 years. You know, these guys on both sides of the aisle have been getting up there and acting like a bunch of school kids out on the playground, fighting and scratching and screaming, instead of acting like responsible adults, sitting down and trying to work through with some common sense and some goodwill a common direction for this country to move upon. And that's wrong. They even ended up, as Joe mentioned in his question, because I guess Newt didn't get to ride on the front of the plane, they shut the government down twice or 3 times. I've lost track. Now, that may sound all well and good to folks. They chuckle and say, well, gosh, we got along without it for a while. Wasn't it nice? Well, I want you to go down, though, to Fort Campbell and ask that G5, that gal, that single mother that has children, who had to go out and borrow money for a couple of months to put food on the table and pay her rent, while these fellows were playing these political games up there in Washington, D.C., shutting the government down. You ask her how she feels about it. You ask her if it's fair. It's not fair, it's not smart, and that's not the way you run a government. You need to go up there and work with both sides of the aisle. Certainly there are partisan issues. But the bottom line is you go up there and serve your people and try to find a common ground and a common direction for this country to move upon. And that's the way I'll conduct myself, Joe.
Keith?
Well, I think I get to
I'm sorry.
respond.
Pardon me, Mr. McConnell. Absolutely. Absolutely. Go ahead.
Even the president yesterday praised the Congress for the agreement that was reached that we're going to approve in the Senate tomorrow. This Congress has been the most productive Congress probably in the last 30 years. A major reform of the telecommunications field, health insurance reform, welfare reform, and now illegal immigration reform. In addition to that, this Congress is finishing ahead of time and $50 billion in spending less than the president requested. And with regard to the balanced budget debate last winter, yeah, it was difficult. It was raucous. It was contentious. Often change in this country does not come easy. But what was lost in all of this was that at the end of the confrontation, the President of the United States said, I too support balancing the budget in 7 years. I don't think any of you believe for one moment that if the Congress hadn't pushed the President to the wall, that he would have ever committed to balancing the budget in 7 years. As you know, previously he had said, we'll do it in 10 years, 5 years, 7 years, 8 years, 6 years. Now it's 7 years. We believe if he's still there, he will keep the commitment. We certainly know Senator Dole will. And this has been an extraordinarily productive Congress out of which much good for America has come.
Okay. Keith?
Senator McConnell, most of the debate about Medicare centers on senior citizens, but what about junior citizens? Even the most optimistic of the Republican plan only keeps it solvent through 2012 or so when the baby boomers start retiring. Someone who's, say, 30 or 40 years old now, do they have a chance of seeing any Medicare in their future?
I think, Keith, that is a very important question, a big question, and I think we ought to talk about Social Security and Medicare both. First, with regard to this big Medicare debate, if you're confused about it, I can understand why. Because there's been an effort to scare senior citizens, an organized effort, since last December. The truth of the matter is this with regard to Medicare, and I'll get to Social Security in a second. The trustees of the Medicare system, appointed by the President of the United States, say that Medicare is going to be broke in 6 years. 6 years. The only way to save Medicare is to stem the rate of increase annually in spending. What the Republican Congress recommended is that the rate of increase in spending in Medicare be held to 6.8% a year over 7 years. The President recommended 7% a year over those same 7 years, 0.2% apart. The Democrats know what needs to be done to save Medicare, and we know what needs to be done to save Medicare, and all of this scare talk doesn't help. In the end, you have to slow the growth. With regard to Social Security, there isn't any question that we need to fix Social Security in advance, well in advance of the year 2012, when the baby boomers will begin to retire and the actuarial problems become great. Social Security is the most important and the most popular program in the federal budget. It will be saved no matter who's in power at that time.
Sure.
You know, this debate on Medicare is the best example I've found yet that Mitch McConnell's been in Washington for far too long, because only folks like Mitch and Newt Gingrich, who have been up there and been playing with the Washington language games, would come out here and vote to cut Medicare by $270 billion and then go to Washington and try to call it something else. It's an amazing process, and they're very good at it. But I want to ask you something. I want you to go out here and ask anybody. I want you to ask the American Association of Retired Persons. They'll call it a cut. I want you to ask the National Council of Senior Citizens. They call it a cut. I want you to go ask people like my mom and dad who are on Medicare, and who, if Mitch McConnell's plan goes through, next year their premiums will double, their deductible will double, they'll be paying more out of their pocket and getting less. They think it's a cut. You know, in Washington they play these word games, and I guess you can dream up and call it anything you want. But in Kentucky, no matter how you slice it, Mitch, it's a cut. Now, there's a difference in the way the Republicans and Democrats want to make sure Medicare is sound. The Republicans' idea of going and making cuts was to go to the beneficiaries and cut beneficiaries' benefits. The Democrats will make the Medicare system sound by going to two places. They're going to slow the cost in provider growth on the provider side, not the beneficiary side. And they're going to go after the 10%, the over $17 billion worth of fraud and waste and inefficiency that's in the system right now.
Thank you, Mr. Beshear. Time up on that time, unfortunately. Ladies and gentlemen, ask you one more time, please. We could avoid any clapping or anything else during the debate. I appreciate it. The next question, Bill Bartleman.
Got one West Kentucky question. The Tennessee Valley Authority was formed 60 years ago to provide low-cost power for 6 or 7 southern states that private enterprise could not provide power for because it wasn't populated enough. Now it's a very successful power company. Do you think it should be fully privatized and that the Tennessee Valley Authority should be disbanded?
That is to me.
Mr. Beshear, I believe, is
Me first?
next, yes.
Bill, I don't think it ought to be privatized, because that'll be the first step doing just what Newt and the boys, with Mitch and them kind of saying, oh no, I really didn't mean that, of privatizing our lakes, privatizing Kentucky Lake, privatizing Barkley Lake, and the rest of the lakes in this state. We need to keep that a public authority, and we need to keep it public power and keep it cheap and keep it low for the people of that area. Mitch mentioned the land between the lakes and how he's going to save the land between the lakes. Well, let me tell you something. The land between the lakes would not have any problem right now if Mitch McConnell and Newt Gingrich last year in that budget had provided for it. The only reason that people got up in arms is that they were going to cut money out of that part of the budget and put a real strain on that property. I'll tell you this, and I make this commitment to everybody that own land down there and to everybody in West Kentucky. We're going to make sure that the land between the lakes stays the way it is for the enjoyment of everybody down there, and we want to make sure that it's going to be funded fully. It's a drop in the bucket compared to everything else we spend money on. The government made that commitment. The government will keep that commitment if Steve Beshear is a United States Senator.
Well, there they go again, selling the...
Please, we'd ask you to repay.
There they go again, selling the lakes. Most people don't understand this, but we've looked to try to find out whoever suggested that, and as it turned out, it was President Clinton himself in the Reinventing Government proposal who suggested that we might sell the lakes. Let me make it clear. There is no serious proposal to sell the lakes. The Congress isn't going to react to the President's suggestion that that ought to be done. The lakes are not going to be sold now. The lakes are not going to be sold ever. I, too, do not favor privatizing the TVA, but I do think they need more oversight, possibly than they've been given by Congress. And with regard to LBL, the truth is, LBL has gotten all the money it's requested. Now, I'm not in favor of sending to any project more money than they've even asked for. And we, Congressman Whitfield and myself, have worked together and provided the funding that LBL has asked for. Now, they're going to need some additional help down there, and as long as I'm on the Energy Subcommittee of Appropriations, which provides the money for LBL, if it's a justified request, you can write it down, it'll be funded.
Okay, gentlemen, thank you. That concludes the first portion of the debate. The next portion, the second portion, will consist of the candidates directly questioning one another. By prior agreement, the first person to ask a question will be the last one to answer. So Mr. McConnell will pose the first question, and Mr. Beshear will have 2 minutes to respond. Then Mr. Beshear will ask a question of Mr. McConnell, who will have 2 minutes to respond, and so on. Mr. McConnell,
Am I up?
first question is yours.
Well, Steve, you suggested earlier this year that I reveal my income tax returns. As you know, both Senator Ford and I comply with the Senate requirements for annual financial disclosure, which are really quite comprehensive and some people believe are more in detail than looking at an income tax return. But I'll make you a deal. I'll make you a deal. I'll disclose my income tax returns for the last 3 years if you'll disclose the billing records of you and your law firm for Kentucky Central over the same last 3 years.
Time.
Well, Mitch, if I had control of the billing records, I might take you up on it. But the court and my client have control of that, and I don't have any control over it, although I can assure you they're reviewed a lot more than your income tax is reviewed. But I'll make you a deal. I'll put both my wife's and my income tax for the last 3 years out there, if you will. I've already put this year's out there. I'll put last year's, year before last, however many you want, because I think that the people of this state have a right to know what we're making and where it comes from. You know, I don't know what you want to hide. I don't know why you don't want to do it. He talks about how extensive this revelation that we got to file with the Senate is up there. It's kind of baloney. You have to file something and say, well, I have something that's worth between this and this. You don't know what anybody's got. You don't know what anybody's gotten it from. I think it is time to have full disclosure, and I think, Mitch, it's time that you put it out there and let us see it.
Mr. Beshear, the next question is from you to Mr. McConnell.
Let me go back for a minute to campaign finance reform. There is example after example, Mitch, in your record over the last 12 years of where you have taken thousands of dollars in campaign contributions and then voted for whatever that special interest wanted. One example is in the natural gas industry, where you took, while the debate was going on, over $83,000 worth of campaign contributions and then voted for their bill. Now, that's the kind of thing that we need to cut out in that system. Why won't you change that corrupt finance system?
Time, please.
Let me tell you what Steve has in mind when he talks about campaign finance reform. He wants you, the taxpayers, to pick up the tab for our campaigns. He's endorsed the Kentucky gubernatorial election system, which is taxpayer funding of elections. And let me ask you this. Just imagine if I ask old Steve to come down from the podium tonight and walk down the street, maybe go down Frederica, turn off onto one of the side streets, find the first home at random, and knock on the door and ask the person who answered the door how he or she would feel about having the taxpayers pay for political campaigns. I mean, the truth of the matter is, Steve is the king of special interests. He's every trial lawyer in America's favorite charity this year. Just 2 nights ago, he was in Washington at a $5,000 a plate fundraiser, and after hopefully getting a good night's sleep, the next morning he went to a $1,000 breakfast. He's a total phony on this issue, and you can't believe a word he's saying.
The next question is from Mr. McConnell to Mr. Beshear.
Thanks for keeping that pledge.
I do want to. That's, please, I'm going to ask you one more time, please, to respect the candidate's right to use this time to talk about what they'd like to talk about.
Okay.
I know everybody's enthusiastic.
Steve, you did pretty well in the private sector the last 9 years. I became a millionaire. I bought a $500,000 mansion up in central Kentucky and joined an exclusive fox hunting club. But during the same period of time, you stiffed your creditors from your previous race to the tune of $80,000. So I'd like for you to tell us here tonight why you spent this whole 9 years while you were getting rich and buying a mansion and didn't pay off the hardworking families who owned those small businesses that provided you credit in your last race.
Thank you, Mr. McConnell.
Mitch well knows that campaign funds and campaign debts are campaign debts. The campaign debt from my 1987 race was owed by my campaign. I had no legal responsibility for it.
Please.
You want to go look at the law, my friends? He knows that, and you do too. Last year, when I decided to run for office, I decided to personally assume those debts and pay them off out of my own pocket, even though my campaign fund owed me a lot more money than it owed any other creditor. I did that because I didn't want to get out here and have people think that when I became a United States Senator, I would spend the next 6 years doing what Mitch McConnell has spent the last 12 years doing, and that is raising money from special interest groups to put in his campaign coffers to pay those kinds of debts off. I wasn't fixing to do that. I wanted to make sure that people knew that when Steve Beshear went to Washington, he was going to be representing the working families of Kentucky.
Mr. Beshear, your question.
Mitch, late last fall, you and Newt offered a $245 billion tax break to the richest folks in the country and called upon our seniors and our kids to pay for it. And now Bob Dole's offering not a $245 billion tax break, but a $548 billion tax break. And even your Senator D'Amato, the Republican from New York, says that you're going to have to cut Medicare even more, Medicaid even more, college loans even more in order to pay for it. How can you support such a plan?
The average family in America works until May the 8th each year to pay their collective tax bill to the government. We're not talking about rich people here. We're talking about the average family. It's only after May the 8th each year that the average family in Kentucky and America gets to keep their own money. My view is that it's your money. It's your money, not the government's money. And we're not doing you a favor to let you keep more of your money. So the issue is, how much of your money should we take to spend as we see fit, and how much of it we should leave with you to spend as you see fit? It is absolutely possible and critical that as we balance the budget over 7 years, we allow American families to keep more of what they earn. The tax cuts that we proposed last year were not for the rich. 90% of the benefits went to people under $100,000, 70% of the benefits to people under $70,000. The $500 per child tax credit to working families in America is not a benefit for the rich. So enough talk about tax cuts for the rich. We're talking about tax cuts for you if you're of modest income, so that you can spend it on your child the way you see fit, rather than sending it up to Washington, have them take 50 or 60 or 70% out of it to pay for a bunch of bureaucrats and spend the remains of your dollar on whatever they see fit. To me, that's the ultimate in government arrogance, and that's exactly what we were trying to get away from.
Mr. McConnell, your question.
Well, Steve's been talking a lot about campaign finance tonight. He may or may not know that at the federal level, you can't raise money on federal property. And I've noticed with interest, Steve, that the governor's been raising money at the governor's mansion, right there on state property, having fundraisers. And so I would hope that you would join with me tonight in asking the governor to discontinue raising money on state property, and also join me tonight in calling upon the General Assembly in the next session to pass a law prohibiting the raising of campaign funds on public property.
Time, please, Mr. McConnell.
Well, as you know, Mitch, the federal law is one thing and the state law is the other. I don't have any control over the governor. As a matter of fact, we haven't had one over there, but I'm hoping he'll hold me one pretty quick to raise a little bit more money so that we can have about half as many TV ads as your $12 million is buying you. You know, Mitch McConnell's talked a lot about special interest here tonight, and we both represent special interest. Let me tell you who I represent. I represent those folks out there in the factory that work on the factory floors. I represent the folks, the small business people, the teachers, the farmers, the folks that get up every day and go to work and work hard and play by the rules. Those are my special interests. Let me tell you who Mitch's special interests are. They're the folks up there in those corporate boardrooms who pay that money for his campaigns. They put all those dollars into his campaigns. They watch their stock go up. They give themselves $5 million raises every year, and they lay off 35 to 40,000 workers. Now, those are the folks that not only contribute to Mitch's campaign, but then come up there and ask him to pass this $245 billion tax break, yes, for the wealthy, Mitch, the capital gains tax, and you know who it's going to help. It's going to help your corporate buddies up there. Yes, there are both special interests involved here. I kind of like the ones I represent, and those are the folks I'm going to represent in Washington, D.C.
Mr. Beshear, now your question.
We're talking about taxes, Mitch, so let me ask you a tax question. We've got over 250,000 Kentuckians who take advantage of the earned income tax credit in Kentucky because they are low-income people, but they work, and this is a help to them. Now, you voted to cut the earned income tax credit and therefore raise taxes on the low-income people, over 250,000 of them in Kentucky, and then you turned around at the same time and voted to have a big capital gains cut for the wealthiest folks in Kentucky. Now, how do you explain that priority to the working families in the Commonwealth?
Easily. What we did with the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is an important program because it does benefit those who are near the poverty line who are still working, what we did was slow the growth of the program. Steve's having a hard time getting it right here. In order to balance the budget, you got to slow the growth. And all that was done to the Earned Income Tax Credit was to slow the growth. We had to slow the growth of almost everything in order to balance the budget so we'd have a country fit to live in for our children and for our grandchildren. He mentioned capital gains as a tax break for the wealthy. Well, if you own a home, you've got a capital gain in all likelihood unless you've made a heck of a bad investment. If you own a farm, many of you can't afford to sell the farm because you've got to pay a capital gains tax cut that's prohibitively expensive. Another thing that was in the bill last year that I bet he won't mention was that there was estate tax relief in there. One of the biggest problems we have today in America in small businesses and in family farms is you can't sell it because of the capital gains tax cut, and you can't leave it to your children because of the estate tax. And so it's breaking up small businesses and family farms all across our country because the government insists on taxing you even to die. All of that needs to stop.
Please restrain yourselves. Thank you. Mr. McConnell, it's your question.
Steve, as we all now know, you belong to an exclusive fox hunting club up in Lexington. And of course, all indications are that there are no black members. I want to ask you two things. Number one, what have you done over the years to integrate this exclusive fox hunting club? And number two, since apparently it is not integrated, why don't you announce your resignation tonight?
Poor old Mitch, he never did ride a horse, so he doesn't know how to fox hunt. Yeah, I know. You know, Mitch, I don't think anybody cares what we do for recreation. They care about the issue. Yeah, I know. You know, Mitch, I don't think anybody cares what we do for recreation. They care about the issues in this campaign, and I'm going to keep trying to talk about them if I can, and I hope that you will sometime remember your pledge and try to talk about them too. Our family belongs to a hunt club up there. We have fun at it. I don't believe there are black members, but there are no provisions. There are no discriminatory provisions. I'm not on the board. I do not have anything to do with the membership. I'm sure that if black folks apply, they're going to be considered like white folks because I'm not going to belong to a club that has any discriminatory policies. You can bet on that.
Okay. Mr. Beshear, the question is yours.
Mitch, crime is one of the biggest problems, I think you'll agree, that we have in our society. And we had a crime bill in 1994 that put 100,000 new police on the street, gave more funding to our prosecutors, more funding to our police to go into our communities and start helping to stop crime on our streets, in our neighborhoods, and in our homes. And it's working because the crime rate is now starting to go down. You voted against that crime bill in 1994, and yet you voted to send $15 million over to Russia to train their police. Now, do you think that crime is more important to fight here or in Russia?
Time, please.
Steve, the Fraternal Order of Police in Kentucky, who ought to know a little bit about fighting crime, have endorsed me in this campaign. Now let's get the record right about the '93 crime bill. I voted for it when it left the Senate, but unfortunately it got larded up in conference with the House. And the final version of it, there were more social workers in it than there were police officers, and we were teaching ballroom dancing to prisoners. Ballroom dancing to prisoners. That's not, in my view, fighting a crime. Now, with regard to the 100,000 police officers, let me say that only 17,000 of them have actually been funded. And interestingly enough, the FOP in the city of Louisville and the FOP in Jefferson County came out against the 100,000 new police. Why? Because they thought it was a phony idea, that in the end, they'd have some temporary Clinton cops, and 3 or 4 years down the road, they'd go back to vacancies, and the burden would still be back on the local government. So I make no apologies to anybody for my interest in fighting crime. It's just that I thought the final version of the president's crime bill was really more social policy than it was getting tough on criminals.
Mr. McConnell, your question.
In life, we all have to make a series of choices. On August 30th, just about a month ago, the president was in Paducah and in the purchase area of West Kentucky. At the very same time, the tobacco growers in Kentucky and the warehousemen and the production people from our plant at Philip Morris up in Louisville gathered at a tobacco warehouse on the other side of town to protest the president's issuance of this rules that the FDA should take over tobacco and make drug dealers out of our farmers. Steve, why did you choose to be with Bill Clinton rather than over at the tobacco rally like I was?
Very simple. It's because I'm going to have more influence on Bill Clinton to save the tobacco program than Mitch McConnell ever thought about having.
Yes. Please. Ladies and gentlemen, please.
There was somebody else. There was somebody else there with Bill Clinton, a fellow named Wendell Ford, who no one can argue. Is there anyone who has stood up for tobacco and tobacco farmers any more than Wendell Ford?
Ladies and gentlemen, please.
And let me tell you something else. Wendell Ford's got legislation up right now that would keep FDA off the farm. And if we had the bipartisan support of Mitch McConnell and the Republicans, we would have it passed right now. They have not signed on to that bill. Why? Because it's politics. They are sacrificing the livelihood of Kentucky's tobacco farmers and taking a risk on our Kentucky tobacco farmers so they can play politics with this issue. Mitch, you all come on over. The president's already said he would sign a bill that had the kinds of stuff that Wendell has in his. Come on over, sign that bill right now. We'll pass it, and we'll solve the FDA problem right here and now.
Ladies and gentlemen, please.
Mr. Beshear, your question.
We've talked a little bit about the extreme partisan politics, Mitch, that has been going on up there in Washington the last few years. And I, for one, think that it is one of the biggest problems we've got. The Congressional Quarterly and the Congressional Record show that you have voted with Newt Gingrich and Bob Dole over 90% of the time. How do you justify to the people of this state the extreme blind partisanship that you have shown in following those birds instead of voting with the people, the working people in Kentucky?
Well, I don't know whether I've voted with Newt Gingrich 90% of the time or not. As you all know, he's not a senator. He doesn't serve in the Senate, and I have no idea. And by the way, the Speaker usually doesn't vote at all by tradition. Steve has said he wants to go to Washington and be like Wendell, and I'm not here to criticize Wendell particularly tonight, but you might be interested to know that Wendell voted with Ted Kennedy 80% of the time. Now, I suppose by Steve's logic, we should be criticizing Wendell Ford because he voted with Ted Kennedy 80% of the time. I mean, the truth of the matter is that is a meaningless statistic. What is really important is who is serious about balancing the budget and who is at the same time serious about protecting Kentucky's interests. And I don't think there's anybody who would question that I've been there not only to provide the tough votes to try to balance the budget, but also to protect Kentucky's interest as we move towards balancing the budget, whether it's ARC, whether it's LBL, or whether it's a new federal wildlife refuge, which is in the bill that's going to be passed by the Senate tomorrow and will be signed by the President, making Kentucky finally a state with a federal wildlife refuge. There are 571 of them across the country, not a one in Kentucky, not one. We were the only state without a federal wildlife refuge. I was able to get that for our state, even in these tough budgetary times. So these statistics about who votes with who, what percentage of the time, should largely be ignored because they don't tell you very much about the performance of the senator.
Mr. McConnell, the questioner shows I'd like to ask both of you to try to hold your questions to your answers to these last questions to about 90 seconds. We're running toward the end of this segment.
Is it my question?
Mr. McConnell, your question.
Steve, you've been touting your endorsement by the League of Conservation Voters. I can't recall any Kentucky politician ever bragging about that, since they are virulently anti-nuclear, which would shut down the uranium enrichment plant in Paducah, and vehemently anti-coal, which could put our coal fields out of business. I'm curious as to why you've been touting the endorsement of the League of Conservation Voters whose interests are so adverse to Kentucky.
Well, I haven't because they haven't. They haven't endorsed me. But I'll tell you this, I do stand for a strong environment, and I firmly believe that we can have a good, clean environment and growth in our economy at the same time. All we've got to do is use a little common sense. But I believe to have growth in our economy, we also, Mitch, have to have clean air. We also have to have clean water. And last year, once again, Mitch McConnell voted to drastically cut the funds that went to the very agency that enforces the clean air and clean water requirements. And he voted to ease the regulations on clean water. We need to go the opposite direction, my friends. We've got to have a clean environment in order to attract business, in order to attract industry. They don't want to go where the environment is dirty. They want to be where their families can grow up and enjoy a good environment also. It is time that we make that investment for our future and for the future of our children and their children.
Share your question.
Mitch, as you know, in Kentucky, as in probably very few other states, the college loan program is one of the most important programs we have, because so many of our kids could not go to college if they didn't have a college loan. I could not have gone to college if I hadn't had one. Yet you went up there last year and voted once again with Bob Dole and Newt Gingrich to cut $10 billion out of the college loan program. Now, how do you justify that to the parents and the students of Kentucky?
Well, there they go again. They describe a cut this way. They describe a cut as spending less next year than we wanted to spend. Spending less next year than we want to spend. Now, most Americans would describe a cut as spending less next year than they spent last year. In fact, college loans were not cut. They were increased dramatically. The whole argument over college loans had to do with who's going to service the loans. The President and the Democratic 103rd Congress very much wanted to have the colleges themselves service the loans. So this was a whole argument over who could best service the loans, the public sector or the private sector. I proudly sided with the private sector. I belong to a party that believes that the private sector ought to be vital and generally does a great many things a lot better than the public sector. So this whole suggestion that the Congress or that I voted to cut college loans is simply not true. Bear in mind, these people call a cut spending anything less next year than they want to spend. Why, with that kind of attitude, no wonder we've got a $5 trillion national debt.
Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you, gentlemen. That concludes that portion of the debate. Now, each candidate will have 2 minutes for a closing statement. The order of the closing statements, as the order of the opening statements, was decided earlier this evening by a coin toss. The first closing statement will be from Mr. Beshear. You have 2 minutes.
Thank you, Bob. Well, as you can see, there are some big differences between Steve Beshear and Mitch McConnell in this Senate race. For the past 12 years, Mitch McConnell has had time and time again the opportunity to cast his vote for the working families of Kentucky or cast his vote with the wealthy special interest groups. And unfortunately, time and time again, he's come down on the side of the special interest groups. When he had the opportunity to protect Medicare for our parents and grandparents, what did he do? Instead, he voted to give a tax break to his rich business buddies. When he had the opportunity to protect the Head Start program that gives so many of our disadvantaged youngsters a chance, what did he do? You're right, he voted for a big tax break for his wealthy business buddies. When he had the opportunity to protect the college loan program that sends so many of our kids to college, what did he do? You're right again. He voted instead for a big tax break for his wealthy business buddies. Now, why is this happening? I'll tell you why. It's because this Congress right now is on lock, stock, and barrel by the wealthy special interest groups, by the folks that are giving him, as of this year, some $12 million over the past 12 years to fund his campaign so he can keep his job. My friends, I say it is time for a change. It is time to take the big money out of this political game. It is time to take the kinds of influence that you find in Washington, D.C. and say, that's enough, get out of here. It is time to send a senator up there from this state who is going to stand up and represent those folks that get up every morning, go to work hard, play by the rules, to put food on the table, to educate their kids, to save money for their college, to save a little money for retirement. Those are the folks that Steve Beshear wants to go to Washington to represent. And if you'll help me on November the 5th, you'll have that kind of representation. Thank you very much, and God bless you.
Mr. McConnell,
As we come to toward the end of this campaign, I can't help but think about how much I have to be thankful for. Many of you know my wife, Elaine. She came to this country at age 8, didn't speak the language, and has gone on to realize the American dream and save our oldest and finest charity from scandal and disgrace. And I think of the 3 children that I have, the youngest of which, a friend of Steve's son, Andy, just went off to college last month, and so the nest is empty. And as I go to Washington each week, and I say each week because Elaine and I come home 99% of the weekends, I've chosen over the last 12 years to continue to remain a part of Kentucky. And you do that by coming home every weekend, by doing your own grocery shopping, by going by and seeing the buddies up at Karam Deeb's Deli, where they make sandwiches for me on Sunday at lunch. And that's how you keep in touch with what's going on at home. And then in Washington, when I'm there during the week, I try every day to take a good look at the Capitol, because it, of course, stands for all that made our democracy great. And each day I try to think, as I go through my work, how can I have a positive impact for America and for Kentucky? And fortunately, most nights I can go home at the end of the day and prop my feet up and think about what may have happened and conclude that quite possibly I may have made a difference for America and for Kentucky, the finest state in the nation. And so I want to thank all of you for the opportunity over the last 12 years to have tried to make America and Kentucky a little bit better place to live.
Thank you, Mr. Beshear. Thank you, Mr. McConnell. Thanks to our panel, our co-sponsors, and a special thanks to the staff of the River Park Center, which worked very hard in a difficult week to stage this tonight. Thanks to all of you listening and watching. That concludes this senatorial debate. Thank you again. Good evening.
Monday night, as part of C-SPAN 2's coverage of congressional and state races, we'll bring you live coverage of an Indiana governor's debate.